introduction. If you haven't heard him, just turn on your radio. We're glad to have him back. America's Mr. Right, Jason Lewis.
Thank you very much. It is great to be in front of thousands of proud Minnesota taxpayers. But I'll bet you could be just as proud for half the money. Yeah, that's what I thought. You know, I'm not feeling too well. My family was kind of sick this week, and I think I'm coming down with the bug, to be honest with you. I was driving here, and I thought, what's going on? Why am I so sick now on a beautiful day? I mean, Al Gore couldn't have given a better introduction than that. And I finally figured it out. The legislature's making me ill. As Grover was saying, while all these other states are moving in the right direction, from North Carolina to Nebraska to Oklahoma to Arkansas, cutting taxes, only in Minnesota are we moving in the opposite direction. Somebody's got to take a stand, and that's why you're here. And that's why I'm here. But because of my illness, or whatever it is I'm getting, as Kim Kardashian once said to her husband, I won't keep you long today. And I'm coming up here today, and I'm kind of walking up the sidewalk there, and somebody comes up to me, and it's great being in the radio, and it's great having your own syndicated show, but sometimes it can be a bit humbling. I walk up the sidewalk, and somebody comes up to me, and they say, I know you. And I said, oh, that's good. I'm glad you're a radio personality. You want to be known. Yeah, didn't you used to have a local show here in Minnesota? Yeah, I did. Then you went to Charlotte for a little while and came back, right. You wrote a book too, right? Yeah. And at one point you ran for Congress. Well, you know, youthful indiscretion. Yeah, but it's true. And then he stopped and looked at me for a second and he said, whatever happened to you? I mean, that's kind of rough. I was leaving today. My wife said, I said to my wife, I said, honey, would you believe on this gorgeous day that I'd be back in front of the taxpayers rally in Minnesota? Would you ever in your wildest dreams think we'd be doing this 15 years later? And she looked at me and said, you've never been in my wildest dreams. It's a little tough, yeah, boom, boom. Some of you know that listening to me throughout the years, I tend to have a bit of a libertarian bent at times. And it's true. And I'm not one of those William F. Buckley radicals that thinks we ought to, just legalize drugs tomorrow, but I am objective enough to take a look at the war on drugs and wonder if it's really working. And for people that don't believe me, if you think the war on drugs is working, how do you explain Mark Dayton? It's just a thought. How do you explain the fact that here in Minnesota we're looking at not raising the top tax rate to 8% or 8.5%. We're looking at 9, 9.5%, 10%. How did we get here? I mean, you people didn't vote for this. I didn't vote for this. Kind of reminds me of the guy in Chicago who's trying to explain why Illinois voters keep electing the people they do. Said, well, I'm a lifelong Republican, but ever since I died, I've been voting Democrat. And I'm wondering if Mark Ritchie isn't registering a whole lot of dead people and getting a lot of other people in office who shouldn't be, maybe, huh? We, as Grover was saying, we don't have a revenue crisis. You realize in the last decade, general revenue funds in the state of Minnesota have gone up 31%. From the budget biennium 2010-11 to 12-13, the budget went up 14%. Now we're going from 12-13 to 14-15, and they want to raise it another 10%. And yet, I seem to recall a few tax increases years gone by. We had the Vote Yes Amendment, remember that? Going to dedicate the excise tax to roads. Whoops. The Vote Yes Amendment dedicated 40% or more to light rail. So we didn't get the roads. We had in 2008 the $6.6 billion licensed gas and sales tax. We had the same year the Legacy Amendment, the $11 billion slush fund for cultural movements in the arts. Minnesota government at all levels right now collects $28 billion a year from all of you. Now think about this. That's $5,000, actually over $5,000 per person in the state of Minnesota that you pay. And we're undertaxed. Now, the left will say, hey, we're number one. And they've got a point. In 2011, the Census Bureau came out with the top 10 states, or the 10 states, who spend more than 30% of their budget on public welfare. Now, do I really have to tell you where we landed? Not fifth, not third. By God, we're number one. Illinois and California, look out, we're coming after you next. The Census Bureau report, we are the number one state in the United States. 37.5% of our expenditures on public welfare. Now, friends, you do not help the poor by perpetually subsidizing them. You help the poor by making them independent. The welfare state does not do that, and it is time we end the welfare state in Minnesota once and for all. Now, in this present crisis, as some of the speakers noted, we don't have a budgetary problem. We've got a $35 billion general fund budget. Guess what? Revenues are slated to go up $1 billion next year if we do nothing. So it's going to $36.1 billion. So how is it we have a $600 million deficit? Because revenue or spending was set to go to $36.8 billion to be accurate. But that's not good enough for Mr. Dayton. That's not good enough for the Senate or the House. They want to take general fund spending in 1 year from $35 billion, or I should say in 2 years, budget biennium, from $35 billion to either $38 billion or $39 billion if you listen to the House members. So we are imposing, we don't have a budget deficit. Revenues are going up $1 billion. If we froze the general fund budget, banish the thought, many of us have had to freeze our business budgets. They seem to be unable to do that. But if we froze it, we'd have $1 billion surplus. If you let it go up the way it's scheduled to go up, we've got a $600 million deficit easily solved. That's not good enough for the Democrats. They are, I want you to understand this, the Democratic Party in Minnesota, the DFL, are deliberately imposing and proposing a $2 billion deficit so they can raise taxes $2 billion. That's what they're trying to do. And yet, the top 50% of income tax earners in the state of Minnesota pay 96.5% of all income taxes. The top 50%, according to the Minnesota Department of Revenue, pay 96.5% of all the income tax. Top 10%, the lucky duckies making over $130,000, why they pay a measly 56% of the income tax. Now, I know what some people think. Well, that's not me. I don't care about the top 10%. And you hear it from the apologists for the big tax increases saying, look, the governor says my tax increase will only hit about 2, 3, 4, maybe 6% of all returns filed. Now that's a clever little game. It only hits 6% of all their income tax returns. Let them raise their taxes. Except what they don't tell you, and what I had to squeeze out of the Minnesota Department of Revenue last week, was those tax increases hit 53% of all business income. So you may hit 6% of the taxpayers, but they've got 53% of the income. That means you're taxing over 50% of small business income. Is that a way to grow Minnesota? No. Is that going to be good for the working family who needs a job? No. No, it's not. You cannot simply continue this sort of politics of envy, mob rule. We're going to tax the other guy, take away his or her rights. It's only the top 2%. Well, what the heck? Let's just take away their First Amendment rights too. It's only the 2%. You see, we live in a country that prides itself on individual rights. We put the individual atop the ethical pyramid so that the mob cannot get at him. That was the great American experiment. The pursuit of your happiness. The individual's happiness. Not Mark Dayton's, not Al Franken's, not the DFL legislature or anybody else. The pursuit of your happiness, whether anybody else likes it or not. You and I don't need to defend the wealthy. They can defend themselves. We need to defend the people who are trying to get wealthy. And at the federal level, the picture's pretty much the same. The feds this year will collect $2.7 trillion in revenue. Guess what? That's a record. $2.7 trillion. Since 2002, federal revenue has gone up 50%. And that's before the Obama hikes. But spending in the last decade went up 90%. I don't know, I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think we've got a spending problem and not a revenue problem. And the bottom line is, as that great philosopher Phil Mickelson pointed out a few months ago, You can't tax your way out of this. Capital is mobile. People are mobile. They're going to move around. They're going to go offshore. You know, the great Buffett rule that the president and Warren Buffett, who's made a living off the tax code, wanted to impose that every millionaire spend or pay at least 30% of their income in taxes. So we're going to impose that. How much is the Buffett rule going to raise for the federal government a year? $5 billion. Because the CBO reports the top 1%'s income tax is already 29.5%. You can't tax your way out of this. $5 billion when we've got $1 trillion deficit. If you confiscated every single penny over $1 million of income, if you took every millionaire's income over $1 million and took it all, you would raise about $930 billion. You wouldn't even solve this year's deficit. And you can't tax your way out of this. We're in a debt crisis. Our debt is now 105% of GDP. You know, I mean, the Greek-style debt is looking good compared to us. So at some point, you got to realize when you've got a debt crisis, here's a novel thought. You liquidate the debt. And if you can't grow out of it, and you can't, and if you can't tax your way out of it, and as the Federal Reserve has noted, you can't even print your way out of it, because people simply take the money and they keep it on the sidelines. You know, let me digress for a second. The real problem with all these stimulus plans, whether it's QE1, QE2, QE3, whether it's, you know, cash for clunkers or the Obama stimulus plan, there isn't a person involved in the real business world that doesn't know one thing about all these. They're temporary. What's going to happen when they're gone away? What's going to happen the moment the Fed says, okay, we're done providing interest at 0%? What's going to happen to the bubble we're reflating right now with all the new homes we're building again, just like in the first part of the decade, when those interest rates go up? What's going to happen to the value of farmland? What's going to happen to your bond portfolio, equities? It's all temporary. And that's why it never works. Because the market makers look at this and say, I'm not going to invest, because QE3 is going to end, the stimulus plan is going to end. You can't do this forever. And if you try to do it forever, you're called Europe. It doesn't work. And so what we're doing is we're trying to avoid a market correction. We're trying to avoid a little recession by setting ourselves up for a big recession. In fact, any government that tries to avoid a little recession by taxing and spending and printing its way out only gives the country a bigger recession. So we had a massive correction in 2008. Instead of liquidating the debt and letting those failed Wall Street companies go under, letting the market work, we decided to reflate the bubble again. We decided to bail them out. And all we're doing is setting it up for the next correction. You know, to paraphrase a great president, let me put it to you this way. A recession is when you lose your job. A recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose your job. A recovery begins in Washington when Al Franken loses his job. That would have worked so much better had I gotten it out right. But look, the bottom line is this. We all know what the problem is. We all know what has to be done. We've done it in our own lives. We've done it in our businesses. The only people that won't do it are the people running government. And if you think these people are going to negotiate in good faith, I've got news for you. The party of government has perfected the idea of being compassionate with other people's money. Taking money from Bob and giving it to Sue, taking money from Mary and giving it to Jim. And they're buying votes this way. Why would the party of government, DFLers, Democrats in Washington, ever, and by the way, and a few liberal Republicans, why would they ever give up the very modus operandi that they use for electoral advantage? So negotiating with these people is a fool's errand. You know, the sequester is living proof. We were forced, or we finally found some backbone, to stick with it. And the president capitulating on the FAA yesterday, the Republicans standing firm, and we're getting that whopping 1% budget reduction this year. But we won the debate. People aren't saying, well, it really is the sequester. They're saying, you know, Mr. President, you might want to cut the $500 million the FAA spends on consulting instead of cutting air traffic controllers. And we won the debate. That's what happens when you stand on principle. You tend to win the debate. It tends to focus the mind. So we don't need a tax increase. We don't need a tax increase here. We don't need it in Washington. we need to tell people that everybody has some skin in this game. You want to talk about shared sacrifice? Here's my idea of shared sacrifice. Everybody who's getting a government check will get one that's a tiny bit smaller until we're out of this mess. That's shared sacrifice. And by the way, and that's not popular. A lot of people, a lot of seniors, a lot of agricultural folks, they get some government support. But you know what? If you went to the American people, and I firmly believe this, and you said, we can't tax our way out of this, we certainly don't want to print our way out of this, we can't borrow our way out of this when the debt is 16 trillion. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask everybody to participate. And I mean across the board. I mean from wind farms to welfare. I mean from the Department of Defense, which is $700 billion. They can handle $50 billion a year. You know, I had two brothers who served in Vietnam, and I asked them, well, do you think there's anything to cut in the DOD? And after they're done laughing, they always tell me, yeah, I think we could cut $50 billion. And if you go to the American people and you say, we're going to cut across the board. We're going to cut across the board. We're going to eliminate loopholes, not just carried interest. We might even have to eliminate, quote unquote, the capital gains loophole and bring the rates down. We're also going to eliminate the abuse of the earned income tax credit. We're also going to eliminate the additional child care tax credit, which is going to illegal immigrants who aren't even living here. And it's a credit, a refundable credit giving them cash. So if you go to the American people and say, you know what, if you're taking advantage of a federal program, you're going to pay into it. Banish the thought? You mean the bottom 50% of income earners who are paying no federal income taxes ought to pay something? You're damn right they ought to pay something. Everybody in the grand American experiment ought to have skin in the game. And the beauty of that, and by the way, that's a pretty good working definition of a consumption tax, the beauty of that, as Alexander Hamilton said, it provides a firewall. Now, if everybody had to pay something, if we truly had tax reform, we eliminated the loopholes, and we adopted a low flat rate of, say, 16, 17%, no carried interest loophole. Heck, I wouldn't even mind taxing capital gains at that rate. So you would eliminate the Buffett rule, you would have one flat rate, and everybody had to pay. What would happen? Everybody had to pay. What would happen if government wanted to raise spending? Then everybody's taxes would go up. But right now, the government can raise spending, the lefties can raise spending, and tax you, and give it to you or pay nothing. That is a recipe for democratic rule. If we don't get tax reform, based on what I just said, we're going to live like this in perpetuity. And that's why it's crucial right now in Washington that the Republicans do not cave in on closing loopholes before they get a flat rate tax that's low, low, low. We are all a bit besieged. We can't figure out what's happened to our country. That warm spring breeze you're feeling right now is the founding fathers spitting in their graves. We don't know what's going on. We're a bit worn. And I'm no literary historian, but it all reminds me of a poem by the great British poet Tennyson, who once said, though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days could move earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Ladies and gentlemen, on this day, at this time, we need to pledge to ourselves and our posterity, and to the United States and the state of Minnesota, that we will never, ever, ever yield. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.